Hello, listeners. Hi, my name is Madhavi, and I'm so happy to have you on Upptalk. You have come to the right place if you want to learn about IT and do really cool things with your hands. We are not just another IT company when I say Upptalk. Think of us as your learning partner dedicated to helping you reach your full potential. We have top notch hands on courses to help you build your business, whether you are new to technology or want to move up in your current job. Let's look around this as our first step towards learning.
Agenda. I don't think we'll be able to complete everything, but this is the plan. We'll talk about the actual objects. We'll see what is a table. We'll see what is a data set, difference between tables and data sets. Then we'll look at the options for creating a table. We'll look at creating data sets, which is basically base data sets. We'll talk about something called stages and pipelines. And then we'll look at the derived data set. And then we'll do various sort of transformations. That is the we did through a custom report, but we'll take notes and we'll do it properly and will. There are different ways for creating a table and we'll look at some of those options through file upload, through other tables, through manually, and on and forth. What is a table? A table is a Prism Analytics object that stores. Basically, this is how Workday defines a table. One of the most important aspects of a table is a tip that it has a user, or I can say a predefined schema. A table has a schema. What is a schema? Schema is the different fields which are part of the table and the types of those fields or the field types associated with each of those fields. A table always has a predefined or a user-defined schema. And then it only contains data that is valid against the schema. If there is any, when you load data into any table once it is created, even if it is through a custom report, if any row doesn't match the defined schema, let's say there are 100 rows in your table, even for one row if the schema type doesn't match. Let's say you're moving in date and the date format for only one of those rows is incorrect. Then the whole row isn't processed and table creates an error file. We'll look at that. A table has a predefined schema and only schema which is valid or only data that is valid can be included in that schema. The next important aspect of a table, which is again different from a data set, is that once you create a table and irrespective of how you create table, let's say I create a table using a custom report, using a Workday report, which is what we did the other day. Still, the next time you can load data from any other source into a table. Even if, let's say, I create a table using file upload for the first time or through a custom report or any other option, I can load data into a table through any of the other means. And that's because data is always validated against the schema of the table. As long as the data schema is correct, you can load the data from any of the other sources, which is not the case with a data set. With a data set, if you have created a data set using a certain means, let's say through file upload, then you can only going forward load data through a file upload in a data set. Tables can bring in data from multiple sources and store it in the data catalog. You can do it as well. Another important aspect of table is you cannot do any or most of the transformations in table. The way it works is we first create a table and then we create some data sets and specifically derived data sets. We can do any transformations. But with respect to data sets, we first create base data sets wherein as well we can do some amount of transformations. And then obviously we create derived data sets for doing all transformations. Table only acts as a means for storing data or fetching data from outside data catalog. Makes sense. We'll list out the differences between table and schema. What is a schema? What is a dataset? Again, a dataset is a Prism Analytics object that basically controls some underlying data and describes the processing logic to manipulate the data stored. Dataset is basically a combination of two things. Whenever you load data into a dataset, let's say you have loaded 1,000,000 rows over a period of time. Now, when you check a dataset, you'll only see the top end values. And when I say a top end values, the limit is maximum 20,000. A data set is basically storing some of the data that, or in terms of visualization, you can only see certain amount of data that is part of the data set. But then the important aspect of a data set is that it defines the processing logic that would be used to manipulate this data. Let's say over a period of time. Let's say over a period of time you are bringing the difference between a data set and a table is that when you open a if you look at a table, it exactly knows how many records are there in that table. You can actually see that this table has 500 records. This has some 1400 records and on and forth. This has some 27,000 records, but let's open it. There's some error. That's fine. However, if you look at a data set in a data set, you cannot know how many records are there in that data set. And on top of that, a data set can, at any point in time, show you the first. I think the maximum is 20,000. If I click here, there's no data. What the right data set would have some data. That's fine. The important difference is that we do an edit transformation. When you look at any data set at any point in time, you can only see a maximum of 20,000 records in the data set. It's only when the data set gets loaded and data source that's created. And on that data source, when you go ahead and create a report, that you'll be able to visualize all rows. If, for example, you create an advanced report or any other reporting, it doesn't mean that it doesn't store all data, but then it can only show you a maximum of 20 columns and rows of data. It is basically the processing logic. If you look at this data, for example, I don't know what it is doing, but any data set at any point in time is defining the various means or various stages through which the data in that data set is getting transformed or processed. Data set basically defines the processing logic. I show you. If I open this data set as an example, this has some. We will talk about this logic in just a bit. If you see the data in this data set, it enters here, and then these are various processing logics that are defined on this data set. Now, if this data set has only 1400 rows, but then had there been 30,000 rows, it would have only shown us the maximum of first 20,000. Well, we cannot see more than 20,000 at any point in time. A data set basically defines the processing logic plus some sample data. The processing logic that allows you to manipulate the data within that data set. Base data sets only allow. We'll talk about stages later. A base data set only allows you to configure certain stages. A derived data set allows you to configure most of the other stages. We'll look at that. We'll see what are the differences between based and derived data sets. A data set basically contains all data about the data it stores. It contains metadata. And what do I mean by metadata? The schema of the data. What are the different fields? That metadata is basically the fields which are part of the data set, which is also the case with a table. For example, it contains employee ID name, date of birth, on and forth. Now, this is also the case for a table. Table also contains all the fields. The second thing a dataset and a table contains is the schema. This field is of type, let's say text. This is again of type text. This is of type date with format D, D, M, M, YY and on and forth, which is also the case with a table. Table will also contain the field type, which is the schema. Again, it will specify whether it is text, it is instance and on and forth. The third aspect of the data that a data set stores is the transformation logic. These are the three aspects that together form the schema for any data set. Data set contains all data about the data it stores, which is made metadata, plus some of the example rows to help you understand the data values. As I mentioned, there are two types of data sets. One is the base data set. Then we have derived data set. And then our derived data set can be published. It becomes your published data set. And we can. What are the different means by which we can create a base data set? We looked at some of those options. I mean, we didn't create them, but we did speak about them. A base data set can be based on one or more external or Workday files. The options for creating a base data set is from a custom report. Recycling is to their root host, which is Workday data. And there are two options for creating a base data set using external data. The first one is through a file upload and the second one is from SFTP. Base data set can be created using either a Workday report or from an external data, which can be using a CSV file upload from your local machine or through an SFTP server. What is a derived data set? A derived data set is created from an existing base data set and or a table. A derived dataset can consume multiple base datasets as well as multiple tables, and we'll see how that happens. When we create a derived dataset, this derived dataset can be putted with multiple tables or multiple base datasets, and both of them together, and we'll see how that happens. It transforms data that it reads from its source. And finally, a dataset can be published to create a Prism data source which becomes available for analysis. Make sense? Any question? No? What are some of the key differences between a table and a data set? The most important one, or the first one, is the schema. As I mentioned, no. Now, irrespective of how we create a table, in our case, we created a table day before yesterday using a custom report, wherein the layout of the custom report was transferred and a schema of the table was created. But irrespective, even if we create a table using a file upload through a custom report or manually, the schema of the table is first defined in the data catalog. Even when we are doing it through a custom report, Workday is first defining the schema, and then we go ahead and load the data of the custom report into that schema. Table with table, we always in table. Schema is defined before loading data. You will have to define the schema before data can be loaded in the table. And this is referred to as schema on try. We'll see later that table schemas can be changed. Once you have defined a schema, you can still go ahead and change the schema. But then every time new data gets loaded, your Workday would validate the data against the schema that has been defined. You can still go ahead and add rows into the table. For example, if you missed any, you can still go ahead and delete rows. That is perfectly fine. Table schema can be changed later, but there are some limitations. And what are those limitations? The first one is you can add, as I mentioned, remove fields at any time. However, to change the field type, it must in. Even if you have created a table and then there is already data in the table, you can still go ahead and add a field in that table. And you can still delete an existing field from the table. But then if you want to change the field type, let's say the date format, you want to change, or let's say any field, you want to change from text to numeric value or numeric value to text or any other changes, then the table has to be empty. A field type can only be changed if the table is empty. You'll basically have to truncate that table and delete all the data, make the field type changes, and then reload the data. The second thing is schema changes are destructive. And what do I mean by that? If you remove a field as an example, all data in the field is also deleted. If you decide, for example, to delete a specific field, then that entire column is lost along with all the data in that column. Now with respect to datasets, dataset, as I mentioned, our dataset defines the metadata along with some example rows. And this is referred to as schema. An important aspect, the dataset schema can be changed at any time. However, you must ensure that the schema matches the underlying in the dataset. Prism sets the value in that column. Even if there is data in a certain column within a dataset, you can still go ahead and make changes to the field type for that data, as an example. But then if the field type doesn't match to the data which already exists, then what Workday would do is it will go ahead and set the date in that particular column to null. Schema changes are allowed at any time. And when I say schema changes, I mean, for example, changing the field type. It is allowed, even if there is data in that field. But then, if the field type doesn't match the data, then the value is set to null. Makes sense. The second aspect, source type. Now, as I mentioned, table can accept data from any source at any time. Let's say you create a table using a custom report. The next time when you load data, you can load data through a file upload. You can load data through an existing table, and on and forth. Then, Workday would ensure, or you'll have to ensure, that the data that you're loading matches the schema. If it doesn't happen, Workday would set the entire row to null, even if there are 100 rows in your table or 100 columns in your table. Let's say the data for even one column in one row, or maybe some of few rows doesn't match. Then that entire row is set to null. And Workday would basically create an error record. For that particular row, that whole row is not loaded, that column. Let's say there are three columns, and one is employee, name and date of birth. Now you're loading some 100 rows. 200. Row number 50. Let's say the date of birth is incorrect, or maybe it's not in the right format. It's EIY. Now this entire row is not loaded. Just the 50th row. Exactly. Even if data in one column in a row is incorrect, that entire row is not loaded. Now we already know what happens with respect to a data set. With respect to a data set, if a schema doesn't match in a certain field, here the schema is not matching, then Workday would still go ahead and load this particular row, but then the value in this particular column is set to null. Tables accept data from any source at any time, whereas a dataset, and specifically a base dataset, because this is where we are loading data into Prism, only accepts data the same source. When you create dataset. With respect to a dataset, we can only use the same source type with which the dataset was created. We have already spoken about the data validation. When you load into a table, Workday validates against the table for a specific field, a specific column. Doesn't match the field type. The field type format. For example, date format. Right. Or this could be anything else. Then Workday. The entire and doesn't into in the instead it creates something called an error file, and you can go ahead and download that error file see what error is there because of which the table was not loaded. And then you can go ahead and make changes and then reload it. Instead, creates error, which can be downloaded. With respect to a dataset. And whenever we are calling about dataset here, we are only talking about base dataset because derived dataset is a completely different logic. Derived dataset you create after you have created your base table, and then you have to do some additional transformations. Right? A dataset here implicitly means a base dataset. A base dataset accept a base dataset validate. Again, these specific will and mark the field type doesn't matter. The entire row is still loaded. It's just that particular in that particular field is marked as. One important difference is actual validation in a dataset happens when the data is being published because if you see when the data is being published, that's when your data source gets created. As long as your data is in your base dataset, it then moves into derived dataset. This is all that Workday is doing. However, when the data is being published, when you publish a data, Workday then validates. Again, the current and again, Workday uses the same logic. Any field that does not match the field type includes it in the when it is getting published. Workday would then again go ahead and validate the final data in the published data. So, if there is still any match or there is a mismatch between the field type and the data, the value is set to null. But then that particular row is still getting published. First thing in a data set, let's talk about a data. No values. What do I mean by that? Workday basically doesn't distinguish between and string. Basically, there is no there is no there is no difference between string and a null. If we talk about it, right, we discussed if there is a mismatch, that value is marked as wherever there is an that value is being marked as, but then certain employee may have a date of or he may not have entered a marital status which is basically an end or a dataset, doesn't distinguish between a yeah, and an empty set for it in field, whether it is a field of type instead whether it is a field of type. You can basically input a null value, which is same at inputting any value at all. A dataset doesn't distinguish between a null uh, and an empty and basically every field type in a dataset, basically every row in a dataset, you can have null. Yeah. And a dataset allows that every field uh, uh, configured required in a table. We, we have the configuration option. Wow. We can configure whether a particular field would accept null values or the second thing, they distinguish between fee, reading, delimited. This is how Workday behave. Let's say reading, egg, separated file, CSV. And this is how you have your data. Let's say you have your first name. And then you have, let's say, the last name, which is Brooke. Then, and then let's say you have marital status, right? We have married, marital status. If I kid, let's say we have middle name. Have first name, middle name, last name. Workday would recognize this as an empty string and Workday would recognize this as a null value. Makes sense. This is recognized as empty. This is where Workday knows that a blank value or an empty value is being passed because there is no middle name and this Workday would recognize as a null value. What are the two different names we looked at when we created our tables the other day? We have a display name and we have an AP name, right? Both table as well as a data set, they both contain a display name as well as an AP name, right? Display name can be changed at any time. AP name cannot be changed once you have created it, right? Another important aspect is deleting data now with respect to a table. In table, you can remove all rows which is truncate. Table support two functions. One is truncate. If you want, let's say you loaded data through multiple loads into a table. First iteration you loaded through a custom report. Second iteration you load it through a file and there are 10 different data load tasks. or 100 different data load tasks through which you have loaded data into a table. Now you can load it. You can go ahead and truncate all of this data, which basically means makes your table empty. All data can be truncated from a table, or only some data can be truncated, which is basically deleting a table, or some rows, which is basically a delete function. Selectively delete rows based on a key field. We can truncate all the rows from a table to make it empty. We can delete some rows from a table. For example, let's say you only want to delete the last load. As part of the last load, you loaded some 1,000 records and only those 1,000 rows you want to delete. You can also go ahead and delete only certain loads from the table, or you can selectively delete only some rows from a certain load from a table using a row key, and we'll look at that. But with respect to a data set, you can only remove all rows from a data set which is truncated. How do we mark a table available for analysis, or how do we publish a table by using for table? If you remember, we discussed we use the option available or enable for analysis. Table displays row count in the data catalog view, whereas Workday doesn't know how many rows of data exist in a base data set. That's why Dataset, you'll see Workday, doesn't display the number of rows, right? Whereas on a table it displays you the number of rows. If there are less than 20,000 rows, or you have different options, and we'll look at that. If your table contains less than the selected rows, then it will show you those rows. If it is more than that rows, it will only show you the maximum of 20,000 rows. Any questions between the differences between a table and a data set? No. That's why Workday, because of all these different advantages that a table has, Workday recommends that we only create table. Next, let's go ahead and create our table. In order to create any object, this is what we'll use. We can either create a table, we can either create a derived data set, or we can create a base data set. Let's go ahead and create a table, and we'll start with a file upload. In order to do a file upload, what I've done is, if you remember, we have created a few different files. Now, how did I create a file? I simply loaded data in an Excel file and then saved it with a .csv extension, because Workday only recognizes, or it only consumes comma-separated file or flat files, not by delimited or any other. It can only also accept any other delimited files, but then it can only accept. The first option is creating a table using a file upload. Now you can, when you are creating a table using a file upload, you can create a table using a single file, or you can also create a table by uploading multiple files at the same time. What I can do is, when I'm creating this table, let's call it ZIF_training. employee survey details. Based on the parameter, based on the table name I entered, Wordly creates a table AP name. I can accept whatever is created or I can go ahead and change it. Change it if I want to, but once I have created my table, then I'll not be able to change it. When the table is being created, at that very point in time, I can go ahead and enable that table for analysis, which will go ahead and create the Prism data source, right? And then I can go ahead and either create a new date tag or I can use an existing tag. One thing to remember, if all the underlying objects using that tag are deleted, then the tag also gets deleted if this tag is being used. Let's say by 5 tables, 2 different data sets. If we delete all of those underlying objects, then Workday would automatically go ahead and remove this tag. Now, if I think we created one tag called ZIF the other day, but because I deleted that data set, now the tag is also removed. I'm creating the new tags here. I can add some description if I want and create now. This is where I have the various options available. I do it using file upload. I can create it manually. I can also use an existing table or a data set or I can use a Workday report. I'm selecting file upload now here. If you see, I can select one or multiple files, right? When I do that, when you select multiple files, what Workday would do is it will use the first file to identify the schema right. And using that schema, then it will load data using all the other files. As long as all the files have the same underlying schema, and when I say same underlying schema, I mean the same fields and the same set of data. Right. As long as all the files have the same underlying schema, you can go ahead and load multiple files. And I think the limit is some 5,000 files. I'm sorry, I don't know what is happening. As long as all the files have the same underlying schema, what they would go ahead and create a table and load that table with all those data from all those files. Now, what is there in this file? Nothing, but each file has the employee age, the year, and the results for various survey. It has various questions. Would you recommend teas for your employee? And these are sub-random employee ratings, and that is it. I can select one or multiple files. For the time being, I'll just select one file and then click. What if I select more than one file? I would be able to do that. I'll say next, I've selected 2 files. Now, based on the files that I have selected, Workday loads or creates my columns. Now, if I go ahead and one of these files again, here I have created some headers, we'll talk about. We'll talk about these headers later. For now, there are 2 sets of headers. One is this header, and then there is another header as well. This is what Workday has done. It has still read all of what it has. This is how Workday is. This is how Workday is. Reading it at the first page. Here is where my row starts E2 and Sovereign 1, which is my row number 2. Then employee it is reading it and then it is generating some field 2 which is here and then it is generating using belonging and basically what it has done is it has taken this as the row headers. Wherever row headers are not available, it has generated some random name. Here the name is field 1, here the name is field 2, here the name is belonging, which is what we see here. Then field 4 and on and forth. Then this particular row that I added, it was for my own internal reference. I don't want this row to be referenced. This is my actual row. Now this is referred to as the parsing options. We'll talk about these parsing options in detail later. But for now, I want Workday to ignore this first row, right? I don't want Workday to read this data. What I'll say is the number of rows to ignore. I'll say ignore one row now. When I do that, if you see, it reads proper data. Now it's reading employee 8, it's reading year, and then it's reading all of these. Right. And from here it starts reading the other data. Now, based on the data that it reads right here in this is simply a plain file. We have not associated any file. We have not associated any file type with this. Right? Workday is simply reading data, and based on the data that it reads, what it does is it identifies what should be the field type. Right? Because here it's reading alphanumeric character. It determines that this should be a field of type text. Now here, if I want, I can go ahead and change that. I can still go ahead and make changes to the name of that. To go ahead and change the API name of that field. At this point in time, I can still go ahead and change the field type. I can add some description. For now, I'll say this particular field is a required field. Other field types. We'll look at the field type options, but again Workday says this is a field of type here. This is the API name. This is a numeric field. If I want, I can select any other options, but now I'll leave it as is. I'll go ahead and save it. We'll talk about all the different field types in detail later. Now my table is created and my insert operation is in progress. Workday is loading data into my table using the schema that was defined when the table was created. It will take some time. Using the first file, the schema was defined, and then Workday validates that all the other files, in this case we loaded 2 files, Workday would validate that all the subsequent files have the exact same schema. Same schema? It says there are 958 records. There were. How many records are there? There were some 490 odd records in each one of those. In total, some 598 records have been loaded. I can go back to my fields. It shows me some of those metrics that we looked at earlier. Employee, it has some 497 distinct values. There are only 2 distinct values in here. One of those files is for, I think, 2020. The other file is for 2021. There are only 2 distinct values. There are 10 distinct values in each of these columns, and then it shows me the top end values. When I click anywhere, it shows me the same metrics. 20 is 51 of the time, 2021 is 48 of the time, and it shows me some basic metrics. If I click here, that is where it shows me the additional details. Now, once my table is created, I can still go ahead and edit my table schema. I can come here, I can edit schema. We will look at edit schema in detail later, but for now I can still go ahead and edit my table schema. But at this point in time, if you see, I can go ahead and delete any field even though there is data in this table. Right? I can still go ahead and delete it, though Workday would not allow me to delete it because this is marked as a required field. But then Workday shows me the options to delete any one of those. I can still go ahead and change the name, but now I cannot go ahead and change the API name of any of the fields as well. If I save next again, I can go ahead and change the table name, but the API name cannot be changed. I can go ahead and change the tag. I can still make it available for analysis. I can add description and I can see you done. That was creating a table with a file upload. Any questions? Says there are you. You have uploaded approximately 900 reports, but the employee it is unique for only 1490. That means there are duplicates. Exactly, there are duplicates because in this case I want duplicates. See each employee. This is how my use case is structured. In each of these files there is a survey result, right? In 2020, this particular employee. Let me go ahead and open it. This is the survey result for this employee. In 2021, again the same employee. Right? There is a different. We'll use the external aid in the unique in our different data that we load through our other sources. We'll have a look at that. One important thing is date format. Now, date format. If Workday identifies a certain field as having a date format, then Workday would go ahead and enforce that date format option. Let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and create another table now through a custom report, and then we'll look at the date format and other options. The next is we'll go ahead and create a table using a custom report. Again, the same set of steps. I'll click on Data Catalog, which will take me back to my data catalog. I want to filter on Z. Once you have set your tag filter, it will persist. Even if you log out and then log back in and open Data Catalog Workday would still persist this tag. But if you log in a different machine, in a different laptop, in a different PC, then this tag doesn't persist. If I log out, log back in again and open Data Catalog, you'll still see this tag filter in here. I want to create another table. I'm calling it ZIF. I'm calling it ZIF underscore training and I'm calling it employee details. My tag is created. I'll go ahead and link my tag to this table. I'll click on create and this time I'm creating a table using a Workday report. It shows me all available reports which are enabled for Prism, and this is what I'm selecting employee details. And I'll say next once again, Workday identifies the Now, when you're creating a table or a data set using a Workday report, then it is pretty simple. Workday takes or identifies the field type of the report and then maps it to here. Right? There is some difference. For example, in Workday, we don't have a field type called numeric, or we don't have a field type called integer. We don't have a field type called long and all those, but a Prism uses those traditional field types. When I click here somewhere, let's see, do I have numeric? I saw in the beginning, if you see, there's something called long here, long right. Instead of that, I can say, for example, numeric, and then it will say how many digits do you want before, how many digits you want after. We have this option to set up this position. I'll select long again. Again, I can change the name. I can change the API name. I can mark a certain field as required. Workday would ensure that there are no null values in it. I can mark a field to be used as an external aid. Again, I'll not mark it as an external aid because we want to. You can have to pay exactly. Again, we want to load data. You have employee aid. But still, I don't want to mark my employee aid as an external aid because if you see, I would be loading data multiple times for different effective dates. It all depends on the use case. In in one of the use cases that I worked for, we had something called. If you remember, I said I worked in a use case wherein we had some 400, 500 group of companies, right? And some of these companies were in Workday, but then a lot of other companies were not part of Workday, right? What we had a mark master system wherein all company details and financial details were maintained. Now, obviously, this system there can only be one unique company in a system, right? This system acted as our master system for importing company data. When we would import company data from this system, for company it has to be unique. We would mark that company it or company field or reference it as an external it that would act as a reference key. It all depends on your use case, the type of data you're loading. With respect to date format, if you remember, Workday date format is a required field. Wherever Workday identifies that a certain field is of type date, you also have to define the date format. And when the data is getting loaded, Workday would validate the data against this date format. If there is any mismatch, then the entire row is marked as null. And can you do custom date formats? No, that option is not available. Let's see, let's see. Let's see. No, we cannot do this with respect. With respect to instance, again, Workday identifies that a certain field is of type instance or multi-instance. And if a field is of type instance or multi-instance, it also identifies the appropriate business object. If later on, if I go ahead and changes that table and add additional fields to that table, then we'll have to add those fields to the schema manually because your table. Let me repeat that if later on I go ahead and change my custom report, which is my source, and let's say I add some additional fields, some instance fields, some other fields, and then Workday would not automatically update my table. You'll What you'll have to do is you'll have to add those additional fields. And if it is an instance, then you'll also have to map the appropriate business object to it. Let's say add a field here. Just as an example, I select the field of type, let's say instance, then Workday would also ask me what is that? Business object. Then I'll come here, I'll identify the business object and then map it there. That is how it works. I don't need it. I'll go ahead and delete it. It is showing me an error because the business object is not selected. What are the different attributes? The first one is the display name. We have already spoken about that. The API name, we have already looked at that. The field type, again, we have looked at that. The date format, we have spoken about that. Digits before and digits after. We looked at our numeric field and we saw all our integers and we saw how we can configure how many digits before the decimal and after the decimal. Business object. Any instance related field will have an associated business object description. Every table as well as every field, I can add a description and this can be changed at any time. required field. As I mentioned, you can specify whether a field must have data. If a field is marked as a required field and your source doesn't have data for that particular field, then the whole field is marked as null, right? Again here, I want employee id to be a required value and then use an external id. This would ensure that this acts as your primary key. Field is not a field. As your primary key, you can mark any number of fields as required, but you can only mark one field as use and an external id, and once you do that, the field is automatically marked as required. One important aspect to remember when you select a field for use as external id, Workday wouldn't ensure that the field values are unique. You will have to take care of that. The only thing that Workday ensures that the field values are not null. That's all the same as required. Right? I'll go ahead and save. Now my table is created. Let's go to the data catalog and let's look at the table. At this point in time, the table is created, but then there is no data in the table. What I'll have to do is I'll have to create a data change task to go ahead and load data into this table. Let's go ahead and open this table. What did we say? An important aspect of a table is once a table can be created from any source, but then you can load data into the table from any source, right? Now this particular table we have created using a Workday report. Now I have opened this table by double-clicking on it. If I navigate to Quick Actions, I have two options. I can edit the change schema, edit the table schema, or I can go ahead and create a data change task. What is a data change task? A data change task allows me to change data or load data into the table. Let's go ahead and create a data change task now. Here, if you see, I can identify how do I want to load data into my table, and every time I'm creating a data change task, I can select a different source. I can go ahead and rename this data change task. The name of this task is data change task. At this, I can go ahead and give it a name. I can call it a Ziff_training employee details data load. And then I'll accept the default values, but I can also, for example, specify how this data is being loaded. I want this data to be loaded at this particular point in time through custom report. I can go ahead and mention that or any sustain. This is the name of my data change task, and here the default option, if you see it is saying, is to load data through a file. Right? That is what it gets defaulted to. If I want, I can select a specific file or I can click on change connection, and if you see, I can still load data through any of the other options from an SEP, from a data catalog, using other tables as my source, through a Workday report or through a file upload. Now, in this case, I want to load data through a Workday report. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and check my Workday report Ziff. What is my Workday report? Name Prism. It is. That's fine. I'm selecting my Workday report. I'll say next here, I'll select the type of operation, and there are different operations available. I can delete data, I can update data, I can update as well as insert data. We'll look at these options in a bit. For now, I only want to insert data, right? And I'll say next Workday Maps. Now, this is where mapping comes into picture, right? Because I have the option to load data from multiple sources. This is my target, which is my table in the Prism catalog, and this is my data source, which in this case is the custom report. Based on the field types and field names, Workday automatically does the mapping. Here we have 27 fields. Here only have 22 fields. I can if I don't see that a particular mapping has been done properly. Now all of these are text fields. Employee it is. If you remember, when we created this table, it was identified as a text field. What Workday did is, it checked all the text fields in my source and then it did the mapping. For doing mapping, it then checked what is the field name. At times, it may happen that your mapping is not correct. Or if Workday is not able to do a mapping, it will not do any mapping at all. It will leave the value blank. I can clear all the mapping if I want to, and then do the mapping manually. I'll quickly cross-check all the mapping. The reason we have some additional fields is because what they automatically created some extra fields. Obviously, there's no need to do any mapping for these fields. We'll look at them in just a bit. I'll click on Next and I'll go ahead and save and run. Now I can only save a data change task and run it later. For now, I want to save this data change task and also run now. Right with run now, it will also load data. I can just save it and run later to load data sometime later in the future or maybe schedule it. This is my data change task, Zeph training employee details data load. At this time, the status is into this target tenant. My activity is complete and it has loaded 483 records. Right, this is the activity. See, through a single data change task, I can load data multiple times. Right here, it shows me all the tasks data. Right, this was the task through which an insert was done, and this is the specific run, which is how many rows of data were loaded. With the same task, I can again go ahead and load another set of data with the data change task. Right, you can upload data change tasks in table. We load data through a data change task. We'll see how data gets loaded into a data set in a bit. We don't need a data change task. Please do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more information, contact us sales@therightuptalk.com.